Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Northshire Presents virtual event. My name is David Wood. I'm the events manager at Northshire's Manchester Center, Vermont location, and I'm here as so often with my good friend and colleague, Rachel Person from Northshire's Saratoga Springs store. I'm going to hand things over to Rachel in just a second to introduce our authors, but before we get started, please, at any point this evening, type your questions into the Q&A box that you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will save those up and we'll pose them for you at the end of the evening. And finally, just a note of thanks. Independent bookselling is not the easiest job in the best of times. And the last couple of years have not been the best of times. And we owe our existence to your continued support, and we greatly appreciate it. Thanks. Rachel.
I'm really pleased to be able to tell you all this evening that Zank Books, the publisher of Susan Daitch's book, is donating 100% of their proceeds in March to humanitarian efforts in Ukraine, which is pretty amazing of them. They are an incredible small press they do great work, and it's really cool that they're doing that this month. I'm also pleased to get to introduce our guest this evening. Susan Daitch is with us tonight to talk about her most recent book, Siege of Comedians, about which Publishers Weekly said, "This offers delights on every page." She is the author of 5 works of fiction, and her work was the subject of an issue of the Review of Contemporary Fiction, along with David Foster Wallace and William Boltman. She's been the recipient of 2 Vogelstein Awards, research grants from NYU, and was awarded a 2012 Fellowship in Fiction from the New York Foundation of the Arts. Her novel, LC, won an NEA Heritage Award and was a Lannan Foundation selection. She'll be interviewed this evening by Emily Hall, who has been a contributor to Art Forum since 2003. Her writing has also appeared in the New York Times Book Review, The Stranger, and the zine Red-Headed Stepchild. The Longcut, her debut novel, was shortlisted for the 2020 Novel Prize and will be published soon. You can pre-order it at northshire.com. Please join me in welcoming them both to our screens this evening. And Susan, why don't you take things away and start us off with a reading from the book?
Sure. Thanks everyone for zooming in, and thank you, Rachel and David at Northshire Books. I wish I could be there in person, but maybe another time. It's a great treat to be reading in a conversation with Emily Hall, whose wonderful first novel, Longcut, will be out in May. And I just wanted to add, in case anyone can relate, that Zank Books, my publisher, is donating 100% of the proceeds in March to humanitarian relief in the Ukraine. So I'm going to read a few pages from Siege of Comedians, and I'm going to read a short section from the middle. It's about the character of the central section is a forensic linguist whose name is Schusterman, and he's been replaced, as forensic linguists have been, by a computer program called Alias, which is Automated Linguistic Identification Assessment Systems, which I didn't make that up, that's an actual thing. And he's, at this point in the book, he is no longer working as a forensic linguist, but he's working as an accent coach, and he gets a big job with a movie, A Siege of Planet of the Apes. Then a blockbuster project found him. The call came from the production team for Siege of Planet of the Apes. The director wanted him to invent an accent, tiers of accents, dependent on class and station in life, for a cast of intelligent apes, that is to say, actors in monkey suits. They wanted someone who would be familiar with a certain transgressive frame of mind, accents that hid other accents. Schusterman, with his various professional experiences, the producers believed was their man. The movie was to be shot mostly at Silver Cup Studios in Queens, so the actors would be trained in the city. The act of speaking through extensive masks, prosthetic facial apparatus intended to make humans look simian, made the actors sound as if they had blocks in their mouths, and that too had to be remedied. Schusterman was intrigued and delighted. He studied the speech patterns of dolphins, killer whales, crows, parrots, and apes, especially chimpanzees, in terms of language capabilities. Given an ape's anatomy, what kinds of sounds could they produce beyond the calls, hoots, and screeches they were known to emit? Speech depended on the evolution of the larynx deep in the throat and the position of the tongue. The first kinds of speech may have originated in instincts generated in the subcortex. Ouch, watch it. You live in a hierarchical group, not just with family, but organized according to clans as well. You figure out how to make tools, weapons, a warning system, alerting others to the presence of predators, but also to food possibilities out there in the jungle or desert or plains. And you need to talk about all of this. Ouch and watch it evolve to WTF. He studied what apes could do, facial expressions and hand gestures, opposable thumbs, all edged towards verbal language. Grinning for chimps signifies fear and anxiety, not humor or pleasure. Trust is communicated by putting a companion's fingers in your mouth. More than one researcher's digits were severed when they let monkeys take their hands and put their fingers in between their chompers. It was someone's job to put the sliced digits in a bag and drive to the hospital for reattachment if possible. Chimps could be taught to smoke cigarettes, ride bicycles, unicycles, and eat with utensils, but not even Nim Chimpsky could marshal sounds into sentences of more than 3 words. Chimps could exercise deception, Machiavellian style, organize the ouster of their leaders, the alpha males, by the primate equivalent of backroom dealings. Schusterman read about the legendary Herman raised by humans, then given to the Tampa Zoo. Herman had been observed retrieving lettuce stolen from him by a mischievous female, but then he turned around and gave the greens to the thief in an act of generosity and forgiveness. Countless humans were incapable of that kind of gesture. Wittgenstein said if a lion could speak, we would not understand him, but Schusterman believed this was wrong. Chimp Nim could ask for a banana. There was that. Unless Wittgenstein meant nobody truly understands anyone anyway, all language is fatally flawed, whether humans are hardwired for it or not. Those circuits are just a bunch of amino acids, glial cells, axons that list toward ultimate entropy, Kutsky. The producers of Siege of Planet of the Apes said, wait a minute. In the first Planet of the Apes, the animals spoke English, some with British accents even. Subsequent movies worked backward through the stories that lead up to the final scene of the first 1968 movie, where the Statue of Liberty is buried in the sand. Look at Rise of, Dawn of, Escape from, etc., the producers insisted. In all these, intelligence-enhanced apes figured things out. Just go with it, they said. Don't worry about the position of the larynx. Schusterman's instincts went the way of, Nim will never understand the past tense or split infinitive. The gap was unbridgeable, but he was being paid to just go with it. So in the end, he did. He researched the accents of people who had been in comas or had brain damage and emerged with foreign accents, though the patients in question were only ever monolingual native English speakers. He studied the class accents of London, Johannesburg, and New York, and the overlays brought in by immigrant groups to those cities, Russian, Jamaican, Brazilian, Bengali. It was still a dream job, and he charged through the roof. No one complained. On the set, the few times he needed to be there, he watched as actors were zipped into ape suits, some much larger than the actors themselves, so air had to be pumped in. As he rounded a corner between sets, he saw a male ape bent over a female ape. They looked up and said they were rehearsing. Schusterman had no idea who they were, nor did it matter to him. There was no need for actors to say anything to him. He had read the script several times and knew they weren't rehearsing. No scene of ape sex existed in the movie. It was possible the actors didn't even know one another, since once they were in costume and had been to makeup, no human faces were visible. Schusterman marveled at hidden hooks, eyes, and seams that concealed rows of zipper teeth. The costume department was ingenious. On impulse, he took a picture of the apes with his phone, but Schusterman had no intention of posting it anywhere. The couple in ape costumes didn't seem concerned that he snapped them. They were unidentifiable, and others before them, before he ambled along, had taken their picture too. What did they care? To the young actors, Schusterman was invisible, but mostly the apes were played by older actors, and it was possible these apes were his age. In his worn Levi's and raincoat with wide lapels, his unchanged outgrown haircut, the 1970s were still present for Schusterman. The clock wasn't really moving forward. The minute hand clicked back and forth between 7:25 and 7:26, not able to overcome gravity and the unseen mechanical hiccup that kept it from ever reaching 8. A sea of monkey extras swept past him in waves of sienna brown, black, and tawny tinted fur that close up resembled fine shag carpeting. Siege of Planet of the Apes opened with an opulent desert city populated by humans. It was never clear exactly where the city was meant to be. The Sahara, Mongolian steppes, somewhere in arid central Australia, or a hybrid combination of all of them. What mattered was that the city was geographically isolated. It rose from a digitally enhanced landscape. Sandstone towers turned coral in the sunset. At street level, people rushed past cafes and takeout stands, neon lit and raucous. The ape-controlled territories were elsewhere, and the populations had no contact with each other. There were rumors, but little concrete evidence, so each cast the other as a combination of marvelous and brutish, and in this, there was a great deal of accuracy. Thank you. So that's a bit from the middle. And the sections are sort of very separate, but they are interconnected, which is something we could talk about.
Well, I thought that I would sort of briefly describe the three sections very
Sure.
briefly, in case anyone listening hasn't read the book or hasn't read about it. So Siege of Comedians contains 3 parts, and then a brief coda is sort of slipped in to the third part. I've heard you refer to these parts as pontoons, which I've been thinking about a lot. And for me, it makes me think of like a catamaran pontoons. I think there are other meanings, but it suggests to me a book as a kind of transport. And you have these 3 pontoons that are joined and they're linked, but they each have their own path. So the first 2 sections are contemporary in our time, and each is about someone with a forensic expertise. And the first one is a woman who reconstructs the faces of the dead from their skulls. So she is adept at reading bone structure and deriving the information from it that would create a face. And in the second section, Schusterman, which Susan just read, he is an expert in pinpointing the deep roots of language and its influences. So these are both tools for decoding the past and reconstructing events, and in Schusterman's case, ape language. So throughout these 2 sections, they bring their skills to larger questions, and from daily life up to existential. And then in the third section, there's a big break, and we are back in 17th century Vienna with the Ottoman hordes at the gate of the city waiting to break in. And the book focuses on, the section focuses on a woman who runs a brothel and the refugees that she ends up taking in. And Susan has noted that the refugees show up in the city. They have no language for discussing things in the city. They have few points of reference, so they are at a kind of interpretive loss in contrast to the first 2 sections. So one of the many things that works so well in this book is the way the sections go together. They're not knitted or woven, but they travel in parallel and they echolocate with each other. And the associations and the themes and the language just fly among them. And even though this is something you might more notice on a second or third read, in the first read, it's very there. Susan is just that deft. The sections keep each other under pressure and they move forward and backward with each other and clarify each other. It's a beautiful experience to read. So I would like to talk about the structure, or start talking about the structure and see what that opens out into. You mentioned to me that that the last section is the one you wrote first.
Yeah.
And I find this quite interesting because it's so distinct from them. So I wonder if you would talk about that a bit.
Sure. Yeah, that section came from an essay that I read many, many years ago that was based on an actual event, that in one of the last battles between the Austrians and the Ottomans, the Sultan in Istanbul was sure he would win. And so he brought his harem, which is to say, all the occupants of the Intertextuality palace. He brought them to the battlefield, he lost, and all these people, women and men, were brought to Vienna, the doors opened, they were freed in quotes. And I wanted to find out what happened to them. And I could find out, I read some contemporaneous accounts in the British Museum that were like falling apart in my hands. And I got to the point where the doors opened, and then I could find no evidence. It may exist, but not in a language that I read. It may be in German or Turkish. But so I could invent what happened to them. But there were a couple of problems with that. And that one was, I didn't want to use the word harem because of all the Orientalist associations. It seemed like a really inadequate word, and I didn't want to go down that road. And then I also wasn't really interested in the aesthetics of the end of the 17th century. I didn't want the window dressing for all of that, the lace flying saucer collars, the camels, the swords, the dry cleaning, all of it. I didn't want to deal with. But there were some interesting, alleyways that I fell into while I was researching it. But I kept on writing and cutting and writing and cutting. And what I was really interested in was that moment of how do you learn culture and language when you know nothing, when you're starting with nothing, and you're in a very hostile city as well. And then over time, as the refugee crisis in Europe escalated, there were lots of parallels between what I had found when I was researching the story and what I was seeing and listening to. Mm-hmm. As people were trying to get out of the Middle East and trying to enter Europe. There were lots of repeats of what I had read about earlier. And so I'm trying to figure out what would happen to these women. The idea of the brothel was, it was not illegal, and it was a place where people would get the news. There would be a lot of coming and going. So that seemed like a good choice. And then in terms of when I talk about tying the pontoons together, when I was bringing the story up to contemporary times, I needed solvers, I needed interpreters of evidence. And one of the links to that was thinking about, there's a group called Forensic Architecture it's a multidisciplinary research group led by Eyal Weitzman, who's an architect in London. And they use a lot of various kinds of technology, ground penetrating radar, photogrammetry, something called LiDAR scanning, which is also a way of looking beneath the surface of the earth. And they use all that to create 3D maps, and they investigate cases of state violence and human rights abuses around the world. And they have a much broader canvas than I could ever have. But so this is the ideas of evidence kind of percolated through my reading about forensic architecture. So I have the character of the forensic linguist and the forensic sculptor, and they're going to be the solvers in the present when they look at what's left behind. The site of the brothel becomes a lens factory, and then it becomes, which is also kind of about looking, and then it becomes the Ministry of Censorship and Propaganda later on. So all of this evidence is piling up, is left at this site, and these are my excavators.
There are quite a few references to, oh, now I'm going to get it wrong, topography, to layers.
Yeah.
There's the one about the Matzah era, which I thought was
oh yeah,
the Matzah Island, the Matzah era.
Yeah, I didn't make that up. That was really what it was called. Yeah. It wouldn't be very.
So this is one of those themes that sort of rockets in a lovely way around the book, is this idea of excavating in, not just digging down into architectural sites, but excavating language, excavating features and physicality, yeah. Sorry, I have so many ideas at once that I can't make one come out. So one of the ways that you connect the sections, and this was something we discussed, is through intertextuality, which, to be honest, is a sort of theory jargonish word, but in your hands it is absolutely not, which is why I'm really happy to bring it up and talk about it. So for me, I find it interesting because there's so many kinds of art and art activity throughout these three sections. So you have visual art and theater and shadow puppets and marionettes and film and propaganda, and so I wonder how these function for you as intertextuality, textualities, how they help the sections refer to each other.
Yeah, I think that in thinking about how to write stories, it was not enough for me to write about characters or in a room. and you let them stew, and they have their memories, and you let them stew, and maybe do other things. And I think actually a really good example of that is probably be like Sartre's No Exit. You have 3 characters, they're in hell, they're not going anywhere, and they're going through memories and sorting things out. But I felt like I had to give my characters toys to play with, and those toys could be restoring old silent film, or archaeological digs somewhere, that I didn't have enough psychology with each one. I mean, it's just not the way I write, and I admire writers who do that very much, but I had to give them a lot of external toys, things that are going to reveal them, because they can't reveal themselves. So they are revealed through the things that they do. That there's also something I talk about. Henry Green is a British writer I like very much, who said he always started with what characters' jobs were. What do they do? How does that inform who they are? And that does a lot of work for you also.
Right.
So that's also something I've been thinking about. I think I've always thought about all my books is, whether they're rewriting cartoons or translating something, they always have to be doing something that is a vehicle maybe into who they are.
It seemed to me it was more than just jobs. I
Yeah.
mean, what you brought to it was more than just jobs, that there was this sort of slipping between real and not quite real, or the real and the made, if that makes sense. Where the first thing that, or one of the first things that struck me when I read the book a second time was that you have the prop maker Lemon Ice,
And I see.
who was making marionettes, or not making making figures for Orlando Furioso.
Yeah.
And the story of Orlando Furioso is almost like the Ottoman Siege. You have these, people who are brought and, made to convert, or and it seemed to me almost like the third section slipped into the first section as a play, so that it was like a shadow story that kind of bubbled up through this fortuitous meeting with a prop artist.
Yeah, that was very deliberate. The Orlando Furioso cycle, it's like saying, okay, you may think you're in Sicily, but here come the Saracens, and this is, or you think you're in Europe, but it's, other people are not that far away. And
Right,
it's a way of ushering in what's going to come in the third section. And it's also a signal to the Karakos, the Turkish shadow puppets are very important to the third section, because they're limited kinds of entertainment that would have been available to them. And that was one of them, or that was something that went on in the harem, was these very elaborate Karakos shadow puppets, which in some ways mirror the Orlando Furioso cycle as well.
Right.
And I wanted that to, so one is kind of signaling that the other's on the way.
Right, but there's this other great connection between, this sort of runs ex parte, but you have Lottie Reiniger, who did the sort of shadow puppet version of Prince Ahmed.
Yeah, and that was sort of fortuitous, finding out about her, reading more about her, because she's also thinking about the Karakos puppets and shadow puppets, and her work is, it's kind of amazing as it existed outside of Disney usually by Disney when we think about cartoons.
Right.
And also her story during the war was interesting. She escaped, and then she went back to take care of her mother, and then she was kind of roped into making propaganda films also.
Right, that's an amazing connection that I don't know, to me it was evidence of how, it's not one of my favorite words for a book, but how fertile it is, that the net sort of expands and brings all these things in that start reflecting on each other. There are a great, you mentioned at one point bringing other techniques from other mediums to bear in your book, like the jump cut and the idea of a triptych. And I wonder if you'd talk about that a bit.
Yeah, there is some, I think as the jump cut has been invented, we all grew up with it. So I think there's that capability of cutting from one thing to the other, like the adversaria, the sections that are factual, that pop up from time to time, are a kind of jump cut within the bigger jump cut that's between the three sections.
Mhm.
I mean, the adversarial was, there was sort of factual information or historical information that I wanted to include. And it didn't really have characters say these things, didn't really, it sounded awful. And
Mhm.
nobody would say that. So I wanted to have these little like interregnums, these little like signposts along the way. And I was trying to think of a word for them, and finally came up with adversaria. So there's jump cuts, between what's going on dramatically and then these factual sections as well, these little factual bits. I think with the triptych, that I've always been fascinated by the idea of triptychs, that you have one central story, then you have the two wings that fold in. And why is the central story the central story? What are the relationships with the wings? And I often think I'm going to do something in threes, and then there end up being more sections than just three. But sometimes I have been able to stick to just three, but often there's like, oh, okay, I'm not done yet, there's more.
Do you
Oh.
feel like there's a central section? I mean, not just sort of, is there a section that takes up more room thematically than the other two?
In this book,
I don't feel like there is, but
really, no. Schusterman is a bit of a hinge between the other two, but not really. Yeah,
Mhm.
I mean, the idea didn't quite, of a triptych with a central story and two ancillary stories doesn't
Right,
really work in this one. They're more sort of equal partners.
as I think back on the book after reading it, Schusterman, he broke my heart. That section just broke my heart. The sort of the digging through layers of things to find out the truth about some propaganda and the truth about a film. Can you talk about that film that he was looking for, this film that was meant to suggest that there were people in the US who wanted the Nazis to win? Would you talk a bit about that?
That was partly, true. It's probably based on, and I think one of the adversarias is about the film that was shot in Madison Square Garden, I think in 1939, 38, and which was a Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden. And so there certainly were sympathizers here. And so being in the interest of whoever was doing Nazi propaganda, and there were a lot of people doing that, to do this kind of what if film, like what if the Nazis arrived and the U-boats land at Montauk and everybody welcomes them, that this was sort of a fantasy, but there certainly were sympathizers here as well. So that was this film that Schusterman is looking for. And he's looking for a lot of phantoms. That's partly what drives him. And something we've talked about is I was thinking about my image of Schusterman was Peter Falk in Wings of Desire. And even that, the scene where he's drinking coffee in front of a coffee truck.
Yeah,
And that was what I was thinking about when I was thinking about Schusterman. Somebody sort of like that, where the clock, it's still 1970 something and it's not really moving forward.
and he's saying you can't see me.
Yeah,
You know I'm here or something.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
I don't know. I found that really because again, Schusterman kept the whole book sort of under tension for me. Like he haunted the other two sections. Like I couldn't see him, but I knew he was there.
Yeah, that was kind of how I hoped he would come across.
Yeah.
I have a friend who told me he had a terrible crush on Iridia. So I'm kind of able to convey compelling characters in that way.
Well, lots of your characters, I mean, even the ones who make brief appearances like Lemon Ice is so vivid, and Nora, whose life is obviously her art, the way she dresses, and I felt like your art scene was a lot of fun, and it didn't feel sort of overdetermined like a lot of
it's hard
art appearing in novels does. And so I just found a note that I wrote about, you were saying that you wanted to resist the sort of ornamentation of 17th century Vienna, and with that in mind, I had kept a note of the biggest asswipe in Vienna is he really went the other direction from ornamental sort of style. It's tremendously funny, your book too. I mean, there's a lot of things that really pierce, but then there's a lot of humor in it too, and that feels about right for its big topics. So I guess we still have some time. I I'm interested to talk to you, if we haven't covered it already, really, in the idea of ways to know things, systems of knowledge. And you have both Aridia and Schusterman who have these very intricate systems of knowing something. And, you know, as we said before, there are references to geology and topology and the espionage and detective work. And it seems to me like all these very precise tools are being brought to bear on things that don't have precise answers. And I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I think they each, you know, each character knows certain things. They know maybe 10 out of 100 things. And then, you know, Aridia knows the first 10, Schusterman knows the second 10. And maybe the reader knows a little more than the characters do. That Aridia knows what faces can reveal under certain circumstances. And Schusterman is good at excavating language. So they're all getting pieces of a story. They all know, you know, a certain amount of stuff, but not everything. But they know what they know. That they have certain areas of expertise, systems of knowledge, how to interpret faces, how to interpret voices, language. I think Georges Perec's book, Life a User's Manual, which goes from apartment to apartment. And you each get, you know, each one is a piece of, they all know some things. You know, one character knows how to make jigsaw puzzles. Another character knows how to make paper, and they all kind of fit together somehow. So they're all acts of interpretation. And there was something else that we had talked about, is I think I mentioned Hitchcock has said he wants the viewer to know more than the characters do. And so in some ways the reader knows more than the characters do. The reader knows the history, knows the period at the end of the sentence, what happens at the end of the war. The characters don't always know at that particular time. So I thought that was one way of constructing suspense, is how these different systems of knowledges give you something, but not everything.
Absolutely. I wonder, I'm trying to think how to phrase this question because it only just occurred to me and I don't have it written down and neatly composed. I don't, you know, I hadn't actually anticipated asking you sort of craft questions, but so the novel I'm working on now is a sort of, maybe I shouldn't say this in a public forum, but like a big ball of garbage. Like I don't really, there's a lot of stuff I want to do and I don't know how yet it intersects. And I wonder if you ever have that feeling, or if you are, well, first of all, I wonder, like, how do you transform research into fiction? Because we've all read novels where the research isn't really digested. It's kind of just presented as if it could drive fiction. And of course it can't by itself. But also, how do you know, did you understand how all these lines would intersect and the effect they would create? Or is it something you found out as you went?
I think it was something I figured out as I went. And I think a lot of what you do, I love the idea of a big ball of garbage. I think that's perfectly accurate. And I certainly.
Good garbage. It's good garbage, but.
Yeah. But, and I know there are a lot of writers, you know, I think people do, they keep notebooks full of all kinds of stuff, ticket stubs, postcards, when we used to send postcards, you know, all kinds of stuff. And that's really useful and helpful. I think with the third section, I cut an enormous amount because I was figuring what the book was about. I really had to get back to that. The thing that I was really interested in is the moment when the doors opened and all these people were in a city that they had no way of reading, you know, where people would be running around corners instead of inside of corners from the interior of a building, that people would walk down the street differently, men and women spoke differently, where you would see paintings and sculpture of naked people, which would be a really shocking thing to them. So that was the thing that was interesting to me. But there were a lot of rabbit holes that I fell down along the way. The story of the inner Topkapi Palace over, you know, generations is really interesting. All the intrigues and what people ate, what they smoked, you know, all of that. It was interesting, but I didn't want to get involved in that. But I wasted a lot of time there. And also there was an interesting character who appears in the book, Eugene of Savoy, who was an illegitimate son of Louis the 14th. who was liked to cross-dress, and but he was also a great military strategist. And his story with his mother, and who was a niece of Cardinal Mazarin, that was really interesting. But I also didn't, and I wrote a lot of it, and then it all got tossed. And so I think you know, a lot of it is just like plain old, like going into the mines with a pickaxe and figuring it out.
Yes.
No quick way of doing it. But on the other hand, especially Aridia's section was really easy to write. And I didn't have to do a lot of research about, I read one book about forensic sculptors who really do boil the heads and get down to the skull. And that was, you know, that was just really fun to write also. And it was kind of a world that's kind of right around me. So that, for the time being, I mean, before Gowanus doesn't get gentrified into oblivion. But
well, I'm thinking now about different kinds of siege. So there's the Ottoman siege, which, so you have literally the doors opening and people coming in. And then when you were talking about, you know, what if the Nazis landed in Montauk,
yeah,
and sort of the doors open and they were let in. And then the siege of the Planet of the Apes also. And so you have, I don't know, this is all taking place inside the Silver Cup Studios, a little, you know, town within a town. And then then you have the Kugelmoogle, right? How you say it? So I'm thinking, I think I'm thinking of like civilizations inside civilizations. And I went and looked up a picture, and it's so great. So would you tell us more about that?
Sure. The Republic of Kugelmoogle, it was originally constructed in 1971 by an artist named Edward Lippberger. And it was in a small town in Austria. And he built it with his son, Nicholas. And then the mayor said, no, you have to take it apart. We don't allow spherical houses in our town. It sounds like something from Dr. Seuss, like no spherical houses here. So, and he said, well, no, this is my spherical house. And he started printing his own money and making his own postage stamps. And in order to avoid destruction, he thought, well, I'll just make it my own republic. And then he didn't pay taxes. He went to jail for a few weeks. And then the mayor of Vienna said, well, bring the republic here and we'll position it on the Prater, which is sort of like an amusement park in Vienna. And the mayor promised him running water and electricity, and that wasn't delivered. So it eventually, I guess it's still there and you can visit it. And I think you can also become a citizen of Kugelmoogle, even though it's very small. I think there's something like 500 or 600 citizens of Kugelmoogle, and they don't actually live there. They could be in Brooklyn, they could be in Saratoga, they could be among us. The Kugelmooglers could be among us. But I really like that idea of a micronation, that that's just this small republic on its own.
And what would the siege of Kugelmoogle? Right.
I think that the Lippbergers did feel kind of besieged, first by the town they lived in and then by the mayor. They felt continually betrayed and continually needing to retreat to the spherical house or micronation.
There's so many good sort of visual references and just things I wanted to go look up as I was reading them. You know, what did this look like? And then I remembered Lottie Reiniger, and I went and watched, you know, some clips of Prince Ahmed, and there really is this doesn't sound as smart as I think it does, a really visual quality to the book. I mean, of course, the book should have a visual quality, but there's a richness with how it interacts with things that exist. And it's really just a splendid book, but I'm kind of out of questions. Do you want?
Okay,
should we jump to other people's questions?
Absolutely. We already have a few questions actually, and the one came in anonymously, and they wanted to know, Susan, how do you write humor in your work? What's tricky about it, and how do you do it?
I think it's really unconscious. It seems like, I mean, I think my first book was really serious, was not funny. And the second one was funny. And it's something that's hard. I think it's unconscious. It just sort of, I think it's sort of ironies just come out. I think I had students once who were twins, and one of them wrote hilarious stories, and the other one was very serious. And they couldn't switch places. They tried, they couldn't switch places. It almost seems like it's something kind of innate that I can't control at this point. But I'm glad that it's, I don't think I could write something that wasn't funny at this point. But I don't know, how do people write jokes? I mean, there may be a way people do that. I'm not the best person to answer that question, but it's a good question.
So the next question came in from Jess, wanting to know from both of you, what you've been reading lately.
Oh, okay. Well, I've been reading Checkpoint by David Albahari. He's a Serbian Jewish writer who left in the early 90s, and now he's lived in Canada since then. And Checkpoint it really is about the war in the Balkans. It's the Serbian Bosnian conflict. But it's very abstract about soldiers who are at this checkpoint and they don't really know where they are, because they arrive there at night and there's no place for them to go. And in some ways, reading this now, it could have been written yesterday, about what's going on in Ukraine. And I'm also reading a book about color by a British writer, Victoria Finlay. Emily, do you want to?
Okay, well, some things I've read recently. I just read or finished Elena Knows, which I found out this morning was nominated for a Booker International Prize. The writer is Claudia Pinheiro, and I can't remember who the translator is, and that's awful. But it's a novel about a woman whose daughter has died, and everyone is saying it's suicide, and she's convinced that it isn't. And she is going across town to find someone who will help her figure it out. But she has Parkinson's. It's I'm making this sound really awful. It's such a good book. It's very hard for her to get across town. So in her long journey across the town, she's sort of thinking about the events that got her here. And it's a book that made me gasp at the end. I sort of didn't see how it was going to come together, and it did so beautifully. I recently read a book written by a great friend of mine. His name is Nate Lippens, and it's called My Dead Book, published by Publication Studio. And it's all the books I read just sound so grim. It's a man remembering all his friends who have died of AIDS. And it's it has this incantatory, say the names of the dead. And it is very much about the toll of AIDS in terms of art, the losses of friends, but it's also extremely funny. I mean, if you want a class in humor in the face of despair, there you go. It's brilliant for that. I highly recommend it.
Can you tell us both about what kind of research or how your research process works for writing fiction?
Well, it's different with different books. With this one, with the third section, I did research wherever I found myself. Some of it was in London, some of it was in Berkeley, it was here, whatever I could find. And it was a lot of time spent blundering, finding out a lot that I wasn't going to use or didn't need. But I think sometimes I just try to immerse myself in a situation or a period. Sometimes if it's possible, I'll watch a lot of movies. If film is invented at the time I'm interested in. And then research that involves professions, like I've interviewed archaeologists or restorers, or conservators, and spent time in their labs. And it's been, it's a really, as I said before, it's a really good route into character, I feel. It's what kinds of things absorb people's time. But I think, and a lot of my work now seems to be drifting more towards nonfiction as a way of using information in ways that are not monitored by characters. So I have been working on these essays that are are more sort of mosaic-like hybrid pieces as well. But it just gets to be very immersive, and then I edit it from there. And research really changed with the invention of the internet. I used to go into libraries. When I taught at the Iowa Writers Workshop, the library at Iowa was amazing. They have the biggest data collection, I think, in the world. And you would just find things that you didn't expect, next to, or in the stacks next to, I remember finding Italo Svevo's letters to his brother, the stacks that I wasn't even looking for. And that kind of, there's also something, the fortuitousness of the tactility of books that's really wonderful too. That is kind of, the internet is infinite and it gives you all kinds of stuff, but it seems kind of easy compared to actually going into libraries and looking at actual books as well.
The Longcut, there was no research, unless you, I mean, I've been writing about art and editing art books for 20 years, so that, that informed it certainly. But my current ball of garbage is very, like, I'm just researching in every direction, and each day it seems to be like, maybe research isn't the right name for what I'm doing. I'm like searching and clicking, but it is feeding. So I'm looking, very interested in the Mozart da Ponte operas. So some days I'm looking at those. I'm very interested in, and this is very much a seed of my next book, in the Ciudad Abierta in Chile. It's a school of architecture that is as a poetic inquiry. So they start with poetry and they build architecture. And it's this community down on a beach in Chile where some of the structures interact with the environment like the sand blows through them. And that's the point. It's very much an interesting artistic community, which I'm interested in what happens when artists get together and everything is up for grabs. So some days I'm thinking about the Bauhaus, and some days it's Black Mountain College, and some days it's the Ciudad Abierta. So for now, while it's still a big ball of garbage, I just let myself do whatever seems right that day. I think there will come a time for discipline and for stopping clicking. But for now, I feel like it's somehow driving things in an interesting way.
It's sort of like vacuuming. Like you just, you're getting a lot of stuff, and then you figure out what you need and what maybe you'll need at another time, but you don't need now, and some stuff you may never need. But right. It's not. I mean, I think that some researchers who aren't writing fiction, maybe who are doing other kinds of work, are very targeted and they know what they're looking for. I don't always know what I'm looking for, and fortuitous things turn up that I didn't expect.
One note for you, Emily, is that I have heard so many authors describe early drafts as giant balls of garbage. So you are not alone in feeling that way. It's a theme that I hear over and over and over again. So you will make it into not a ball of garbage. I have faith.
I have faith.
Yes. The next question came in from Nassim. For you, Susan, saying, did you know from the start that Siege of Comedians was going to split into 3 parts, or were they written separately and you realized the connections later?
I knew it was going to be in parts. Yes, I did know that. I was never going to write something straight through, especially because I started with the 3rd story, the historical story, and I really didn't want to write historical fiction on its own. So it was going to be bracketed by other kinds of stories. Because writing this straightforward linear historical fiction that project didn't really interest me. So it was going to have to go through layers of interpretation, which is what happened.
There's a question here for you, Emily, from an anonymous attendee. He says, or they say, is that the egg from the Longcut in your hand?
No, this is a yoga tune-up ball that I'm using because I'm fidgety, and it keeps me from, I don't know, biting my nails. But that was very observant, someone out there.
We were talking earlier, Emily, about your giant ball of garbage, which is not going to be a giant ball of garbage. Susan, could you tell us a little bit about what you're working on next?
Well, I've been working on these essays, which I have a lot of them sort of all put together, and I've been working on another one I've just been working on one that's starts out with the marriage between Keynes and Lydia Lepkova, who was a dancer with Bali Roos, and how he was part of Bloomsbury. Bloomsbury wasn't very welcoming to her. I think that her form of modernism was opaque to them. They really worked, Virginia Woolf and her friends, they really worked with language, not with groups of dancers where there's a lot of noise and moving around. And so she was annoying to them, and they weren't very welcoming to her. And from there, I was also interested in the role she was famous for was the Lilac Fairy, who's like, she is the fairy in Sleeping Beauty who puts everyone to sleep. She's like the Ambien of fairy tales. And so I talk about the Lilac Fairy and the Green Fairy, which is absinthe. And then I'm also interested in how memory works. How do you remember long phrases of movement? And I also talk to friends who are in Lucinda Childs, which is her work is very challenging to remember. And she also worked often in sort of collaborative groups. She worked with Philip Glass and Sol LeWitt. Diaghilev worked with Picasso and Cocteau, and they produced their different kinds of modernisms. So I have this essay in pieces that I've been working on. And then I was interested also in trying to do something that's very different from anything I've done before, which is to write some speculative fiction that's sort of futuristic. And that's in a file somewhere on my computer, and I look at that every once in a while too.
That sounds fabulous. Thank you so much. We are just about out of time, so I think it is a great moment to wrap up on hearing about future projects. Susan and Emily, thank you both so much for taking the time to speak with us this evening. This has been a really interesting evening. Audience, thank you for being here with us. You can order Siege of Comedians at northshire.com or pick it up in either Northshire bookstore store location. And you can pre-order Emily Hall's The Longcut on our website. David put a link in the chat, but you can also just go to northshire.com and find it that way. While you're there, you can also check out our list of great upcoming events, and we hope to see you back for another event soon.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Susan
And
and
have a great
Emily.
night.
Take care.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.